welcome to Digital Thangka Workshop. This is the last, or maybe not the last, we'll see how we go, but this is, we're getting towards the end of our project. We're going to today look at the way that our Lotus is going to be rendered or shaded, and depending on how we go, we may get through that in one tutorial or maybe two. And then finally the last step that we're going to take, which is probably going to be next week, will be adding texture. And that'll be quite a short class. So we're up to the point where we've got our colours done, our colour flats. We've got our line work done. If we switch on our line, we can see our line. And now it's time to either what's called shading or rendering. And that brings our two-dimensional object, which is just a flat plane at the moment, into a three-dimensional representation of a stylized lotus. In order to do that, we have to talk about what's called shading models. So I'm assuming if you're watching these tutorials, you're interested in digital art, and so if you were into 3D rendering, for example, then you have some idea of what's called shading models. I'm going to look at the terminology that's used in 3D rendering, because as I said, if you're a digital artist, then that's perhaps what you'll understand. If you're a traditional artist, then you'll understand a different set of terminology, and if you're a photographer, you'll understand another set of terminology. But here we'll try and stick with the terms that are used in 3D rendering. First thing to say about shading something is that the form that we're going to describe has to be created by a light source. So that's the only thing that gives dimensionality to our object. Thangkas have a very, very simple shading structure, and that's why one of the reasons they're so easy to paint, because they have a very set method of shading. You never see in a thangka, for example, a directional light source, like a spotlight or a sun. Nothing ever casts a shadow, and there is never a strong direction to the light source. Thangkas are shaded in what would be called today in a way that's best described as either global illumination, or there's another term which is known as ambient occlusion. In photography or art, if you do outdoor painting, for example, or photography outdoors, the model that's best described there is what's called dull overcast. Probably not bright overcast. Bright overcast has more of a direction to it, but dull overcast has this what's called global illumination, where everything is lit pretty much evenly on all sides by the sky. When the sky is overcast, it becomes like a single diffuse light source, and that's how thangkas are rendered. As I said, in digital art, it's called ambient occlusion. You need to have a clear idea of what this is, because when you go to shade your lotus or a scarf or the shape of the Buddha's arm or fingers, you have to know which areas are going to be light and which areas are going to be dark. And those areas of light and darkness are determined by your light source. So in order to best understand that, I've found a couple of examples of global illumination or this dull overcast light source or ambient occlusion. We're going to look at those. They're modern examples, and then we're going to look at some thangkas and see how various thangka artists have made decisions about how they're going to render things in 3 dimensions. I've got a very old traditional thangka that we're going to look at, and then I've got 3 contemporary masters that we're going to look at as well. Okay, so first thing first, we'll take a look at what's known as I said before, ambient occlusion. Now with ambient occlusion, what happens is that there's no directional light source, so you don't see, for example, a cast shadow anywhere. The areas that receive dark shading are defined by their proximity to another object. So as light bounces between two close objects, the light is absorbed and that area is rendered as dark. And so that's why on the frog's fingers here we can see it goes to the darkest shading in the whole picture is in the where this crease is the greatest. It's also around the mouth and here. And so that's similar when you're doing your thangka, when you're shading your lotus, the areas that have greatest proximity to other objects receive the greatest amount of shading. Then, on top of that, the areas that receive the most light become the lightest objects. And that's how you need to think. If you have trouble visualizing how things should be shaded, then you can look at examples online, or you just need to become more observant. Painting still life, for example, is a wonderful way of becoming more observant about shading. So that's an example of ambient occlusion. And I think that's the model that's most close to the way thangkas are rendered in today's language and in today's computer world. I have another example of ambient occlusion here. Again, you can see where the objects are close together, where they crease into different areas, then they're shaded the most dark. And there's no particular directional light source that you could pick up. The ground plane is interesting to observe because that also occludes light. So the light is, in a general sense, you can say that the light is shining in a direction, and that's down, due to there being no light coming from the ground up. So that's another example of ambient occlusion. Another interesting thing to say about thangka rendering is that it's very, very rare for an object to have very much highlight value. There's never a thing called spectral highlight, which is in computer rendering would define a glossy object. Sometimes you see it in, let's say, the jewels that adorn the crown or the wrist or the armband ornaments. Sometimes the artist will put a little dot of white paint there, which indicates that there is a spectral highlight, that's a shiny object. But the highlight values are generally very, very minimally above the mid-tone area. The shading values, however, can go quite a bit lower, and that's what we're going to look at today when we look at our contemporary artists. Here in this rendering of the basic geometric objects, we can see that it actually goes to very dark tonal areas. In thangka painting, it's very rare that you go very deep in the shadows. You'd never see a black shading, for example. The tonal range is very, very small in the shading. And as I said, we'll look at that in some examples. Okay, so let's take a look at, we're going to look at 4 thangkas and see what the artist who painted those has decided to do in terms of their shading model. So this is a very old thangka. This is painted in a very Chinese style from the Situ Panchen art school. And as I said, very strong Chinese influence there. Let's take a look at the shading that's been used here. Let's focus on the skin. So straight away we can see that there's a little, this is the deltoid area, and where these lines define the shape of the deltoid, we can see that there's a little bit of shading. We've come down slightly in the tonal value here. Similarly, when we come across to this area of the robe, there's a little bit of shading occurring here. In the yellow areas, we can see a little bit of shading, but it's not very much. It's very subtle. And as you can see, there's no highlight. There's nothing raising these areas above mid-tone. Even though some of these fabrics would be silk, and in traditional art they would deserve to be rendered in a way that produces a highlight. In thangka painting, that's very rarely done. So nothing is bringing this above our base colour of yellow. It's getting shaded darker in a few areas, but nothing is taking it higher. We can see in the hat, for example, there's absolutely no shading here. Nothing is defining this shape at all. It's purely being defined by the line. And so the artist here has chosen quite a dark line in order to support that lack of shading. So you need to make those decisions as the thing that's going to define your objects is line and shading. So where there's an absence of shading, then the line needs to be stronger. In the face, which is shaded very subtly and incredibly beautifully, you can see the line is playing less of a role. Here in the robes, which again are minimally shaded, then the line plays more of a role. So those areas of subtlety need to come out in your painting. And then, of course, in the Chinese style, these incredibly beautiful misty clouds, which are completely free of any outline. And that's not something we see so much in modern Thangka painting, but I think it's incredibly beautiful. I like to see more of it. And then this beautiful brushwork here in the rocky formations. Again, defining the shape with a dark line and what I would call minimal shading. Okay, so it's a very old and very beautiful traditional Thangka. Let's take a look at three modern masters. So up first we've got, it's Andy Weber. So we've got Andy. What's he decided to do here? Okay, so straight up we can see Andy's done pretty much zero shading on the pericarp here. Underneath Vajrasattva here, there is no shading underneath the deity on the moon cushion. The Lotus has received heavy shading. Very beautiful. Let's look at the deity. So here Andy's chosen to use a dark line. So it's quite a dark line and what I would call minimal shading to define the shape of the body. So a lot of reliance on the outline here. Then in the scarf we've got kind of a combination of the two. We've got a solid line, but we've also got very beautiful rendering defining the folds of the scarf. So again, these are all decisions that you'll have to make as a Thangka artist. Here are some beautiful shading. So here Andy's just darkened this area and then darkened this fold as well. And I'm not sure whether this is his base colour or whether he's brought this lighter blue up a little bit. But again, decisions that you have to make. The degree of rendering needs to be contained, otherwise it will start to verge into being photorealistic, and that's definitely not what you want if you want a traditional look to your painting. Again, in the landscape, minimal shading here, no line whatsoever here. I'm not sure if this is airbrushed. And then a very beautiful and basic gradient in the background. Okay, next Thangka. Robert Beer. Let's look at what Robert Beer's done here. So this is an incredible work. I know Robert Beer uses airbrush, so these areas are airbrushed. No outline here at all. When we come into the body, this is Kukurupa, I believe, the dog lover. And here we can see Robert Beer's chosen a very light outline, so much less reliance on the line than Andy Weber used. And then again, minimal shading of the body in the fold here. And then in the face. So that's an example of becoming less reliant on the outline. But then as we come down here to this Lotus section, if it is a lotus. I'm not sure what that is, but here more reliance on the line, and here in the pattern that's defining the meditation cushion or mat. In the vase, the pitika. Here we see a little bit of line coming in. So again, this is airbrushed, I'd say, by the look of the spatter there. But just bringing that colour down and defining that area. No line here, no line here or here. And then in the rock area, again, no line, just defined by shape. In this case, with an airbrush. It's a very beautiful thangka. Okay, last thangka. We're going to look at Milarepa. So this is by another contemporary artist, Pema Namdro Thaye, and this is different to our previous two thangkas in that it uses a lot of shading. And this Pema is an artist who shades very dark. So here underneath Milarepa, in this hair section, very dark, and in the sternum area, shading to very dark, the cave, very, very dark. And the shading within the nectar here, very dark. Here's an example we can see of some highlights. There's just a little bit of white tint coming in to accentuate the points of that nectar. Again, a lot in this landscape area, a lot of contrast. So going from very dark to quite light. So you normally don't see that amount of tonal range. Here, the beautiful cloud, no line, just beautiful soft rendering. And then, of course, as I said, in the body, a lot more rendering than we've seen in the previous thangkas. So this is an example of a very high contrast thangka. You generally don't see thangkas that high in contrast. Let's have a look at the rendering on the robes. So not a lot of rendering there at all. In fact, almost none. It pretty much relies completely on the outline to define the robe. There's shading in these darker areas, but in the light area there's no shading at all. So as I said, again, all decisions that you have to make. And that balance, that subtlety is what creates the beauty and the art, and will make you a wonderful artist. Beautiful cloud here, no outline. Okay. So there's some examples that hopefully will help you to make a few decisions when you're rendering your lotus. Let's take a look at our lotus, and maybe we'll start doing some work of our own. I'll make some decisions. I wanted to introduce you to a very important technique or hint that I use. It's nothing new, but it's not something that was probably, definitely not accessible to thangka artists in the past. One of the most important things when you're painting, whether it be Western art or thangka, is that for the image to read well, it's generally accepted that for it to read well in colour, it needs to read well tonally, meaning in black and white. Many artists in the past have photographed their work in black and white. If you're painting with traditional medium, photograph in black and white and check your tonal values before you sign off on the work and before you consider it to be complete, just to make sure that there's not something that's escaped you. Or sometimes you can be looking at your work and it's just not, it doesn't matter how much you change the colours, it just doesn't come together. Often there can be a tonal problem. So I'm going to show you a method for checking your tonal values. Of course, digitally everything is easy. So what we need to do to check our tonal values. So let's say our scenario is we finish colouring our Lotus, we're happy with it, we just want to check our tonal values, or we're thinking to ourselves, that's not working, I need to check this. Take what's called an adjustment layer. Yeah, adjustment layer. There's a few things you can pick here. You can go black and white, but you actually hue and saturation is better for reasons that I'll explain later. And so this needs to sit on the top of your layer stack. And all you do is you take the saturation and you turn it down. The reason I chose saturation rather than black and white is because you may want to just experiment with, what's it look like if I become more saturated or less saturated? Is there some subtlety there that I can play with? And of course you always want to avoid doing something like that, which is tempting when you're a beginning artist, but subtlety is important. So turn your saturation down. That sits up there as an adjustment layer, and you can just turn it on and off. So you're working away and you want to check your tonal values, you just turn it on for a second and you can check what you're doing. It's worth commenting on what we find when we turn on the tonal values here. This artist has chosen all these colours to be tonally pretty much identical. So what was pink and yellow and gold here, which is almost the same as the Lotus petal here, is almost tonally identical. So tonally there's a very different rhythm to what there is in colour. And then this dark green and this what was dark blue are very close tonally as well. So even though there's I think multiple colours, tonally there's really only basically 2 or 3 things happening. So that's interesting. We're going to keep that up there because you need to keep that all the way through your work. Keep checking. So we're almost ready to start rendering. We've got in mind our shading model, and all we need now is to talk about a few technical things and we'll be on to painting. The first thing to talk about is the idea of non-destructive editing. So one of the great things about working digitally is you have the opportunity to make changes which are impermanent. So that's a very good concept. Meaning that you have layers that sit above your base colour layer which contain the shading information but don't actually affect the layer that's below it. They affect it in terms of changing the tonality, but it doesn't make a permanent change to that colour information because it's sitting above and it's informing the layers that are below. So that's non-destructive. The worst, you can do it, but some people, for example, paint or shade. You can shade with what's called the dodge and the burn tool. So the burn tool darkens, the dodge tool lightens. But every time you touch your image with those tools, it's changing the pixel values, and the more you do that, the more the image gets degraded. And at some point, if you need to make a major change, the colour value and everything is so corrupt, you really have to start from the beginning. So I'm going to show you a technique which I learnt, which is by far the best way of shading that I know. So I'll pass it on to you, and hopefully you'll, if you don't know it already, you'll agree that it's a superior method. So the first thing to do is to set up our layers of shading. So we're going to add 3 layers to define the dark values, and let's say 2 layers to define the colour values, the highlight values. So with our colour layer selected, we need to add 1, 2, 3 layers. Then using the Shift or the Command key, we select those 3 layers and we change their blend mode to soft light. Okay, so that's the most important thing, is that they're in soft light blend mode. We can also use overlay blend mode, but you really soft light is better for a number of reasons. Then if you like, you can label these, or you can give them a colour. So I think we're going to give them a colour. Let's see if we can do that. we'll make them, let's say, blue. Then above that we're going to add 2 more layers. We're going to make them soft light as well, and we'll give them a colour. So I'm giving them the colour by right clicking on them. Let's call them yellow. And just so that it's clearer, I'll call them highlight. And I'll call these shadow. Okay. Now, to create our shadow, what we need to do is we need to paint in these shadow layers in black and in highlight layers in white. And in soft light blend mode, what that does is it, in the case of black, darkens the colour values as though it's a shadow tone, and in the case of white, it'll lighten the base or mid-tone value. And the subtle combination of those two things will produce the rendering in our image, the three-dimensionality in our image. At the end of the tutorial, we're going to look at the colour value that's produced here, but that's so for example, in our shadow areas, we don't actually want them to be a darker version of pink. Shadows should be both darker but also cooler. So we're going to use these layers to introduce darkening, but also a cooling of the colour, meaning it goes closer to blue or in some cases purple. And the next thing to talk about is how we're going to paint in these areas. So this is basically an airbrushing technique. So straight up you think to yourself, I'll select the airbrush. Modern versions of Photoshop have an actual airbrush, which is really cool, but it's quite difficult to operate and very laborious to use. It produces an airbrush-like effect, so there's spatter and granularity to it. You're actually better doing your painting with just the old school airbrush, which is just a very, very soft brush, and then if you need to bring colour value to it later, you do it later all in one step rather than doing it individually all the time. That's the way I work anyway. So let's look at the brush we're going to check, or we're going to select. So way up here we've got our brush. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to come out of that. We want to be in the this is a very basic dialog box. We actually want to edit that brush. So we're going to press the shortcut, which is F5. And that brings up our brushes palette. And just to make life a little bit easier, I think I'm going to drag this over here into the middle of the screen where you can see it. And we'll, whoop, there we go. Now, it's tempting to say, the first thing to say is that the brush needs to be soft. So hard's no good. We need to have a soft edge. So there's two things that create a soft edge to the brush. One is the hardness, which is obvious. The second one is the spacing. This took me quite a while to actually clue on to this. The spacing determines how closely stamped the brush head is together. So it's obvious if I turn up the hardness and I increase the spacing, then as you draw, you'll be drawing a series of dots. And as you decrease the spacing, the dots get close together and eventually it forms a solid line. In the old days when we had slow computers, you couldn't really have a spacing of 1%. Well, you could, but a spacing of 1% becomes more intensive on your computer. If you're painting with a large complex brush, then the computer can lag and the sort of brush tip drags behind your pen. So you'd reduce the spacing accordingly. But in the context of a soft brush that's used for airbrushing, if I turn the spacing all the way up, then essentially the fall off between solid white going to transparent only occurs in the last sort of 20% of the edge of the brush. And what you're looking to achieve is a gradient that begins in the center of the brush and falls off almost immediately. So to do that, you need to reduce your spacing as much as you can until it starts to become dotty. So normally it's around 27%. So if I keep going, it's going to become dotty. Let's try for 30. And you can see that creates a much more gradual fall off, going from solid white in this example all the way through to completely transparent. And that's what you want for a shading brush. In addition to that, these little dotty areas, I'm not sure if you can see that on your YouTube screen, but the little variance in the middle actually helps you, because it, as I've said in previous tutorials, it takes away from that very crisp, perfect digital look. You're painting in imperfection by using a brush that's spaced at 30%, and it'll bring some value to your shading rather than just having a very clinical gradient going from A to B. Okay, so that's the two reasons for doing that. Another thing you can do if you're super keen is you can, I experimented with this a little bit, you can, in Photoshop you can make your own brushes, and you can make your own brush out of just a circular gradient, and that actually produces a softer fall off than the default soft brush in Photoshop. So I might look at that in another tutorial. You can look it up online if you want to work out how to create your own brush, but if you want the best fall off possible, then create your own brush using the gradient tool going between white and black. Okay, so we've got our brush set up. We can close that. That's the only brush I ever use. 99% of my work is done with this brush. It's just a matter of changing the size. The other parameter that you need for your brush is, depending on the base layer you're shading, up here in opacity, you want that between 30 and 60%. So for if I'm shading a light colour, so let's say it's tonally lighter than that pink, like a bit lighter than that, then I'll go to 60%. If I'm shading dark colours, then you can come all the way down to 30%. It's important that this is never at 100%, because you can't add more than solid black. So what you might find is that you're shading in an area which is shaded by two petals rather than one. So the colour value, the shading value that's occurring in that place where the area is doubly shaded needs to accumulate over 2 or 3 brush strokes. If you're painting at 100%, you can't increase it. You're always turned up to 11, so to speak. You need to be have some headroom. So that's why you need to avoid painting at high opacities. In addition to that, if you paint at a very high opacity, it's just going to be too dark. You'll be rendering way too dark. So let's have just a quick look at how this shading thing works. We'll just do a really gross example. Let's select our channel. Let's say we want to shade this pink area of the lotus. So Command click selects the pink area. Go Command H here to hide, because it's annoying having that. So the selection's still active, we're just hidden it. Then come into our bottom shadow layer, got our brush set up, and let's have a look at what it does. So let's say I'm wanting to shade this part of the lotus. I'll just come in here, and there's our shading. So if I toggle that on and off, you can see what we've just done. So very beautiful, very easy. If I want to add more shading to the root of that, I can come down a size in the brush, and then I can double up. If I had have gone 100%, there would be no option to do that. So essentially here I've got what would be the equivalent of a 60% brush, because I've done 2 strokes with it. Another example here, we can just shade like that. So you can build up your shading very quickly in simple areas. I'm just going to do this pretty rough and ready. And then what we'll do is I'll do it accurately and sped up, so you can see. This is going to demand some shading underneath where this petal folds over. So this is why we have multiple layers. So if I do it here, my brush is going to extend onto this rear lotus petal. I'm going to shade that too dark. So here, this is where you pop up to another layer, you shade across, and then you can erase from that back section of pink without it erasing your existing shading. So there's our rendering. Let's turn it on and off. I'll merge those two together for you so you can see it. So there's our shading. So what I'll do is I'll continue to work to shade the image, and I'll speed it up so you can see me working, because this will take probably about 3/4 of an hour. And then when we get to the section where we're starting to do highlights, I'll stop that and we'll talk about highlights, because that's a slightly different technique.